Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Naseem Humanrod, and I am with the Houston Immigration Legal Services Collaborative. At the beginning of this year, a collaboration was created with our partners, the Children's Immigration Law Academy, Houston Galveston Trauma Institute, Tahirih Justice Center, and Justice for Our Neighbors. And we wanted to bring you a web series for attorneys by mental health clinicians and immigration attorneys to address best practices in working with traumatized clients, mental health, and forensic evaluations for immigration cases. This webinar series will cover trauma-informed lawyering, how and why to use forensic evaluations, creating a collaboration with mental health clinicians, court prep, testimony, and more. We're excited to kick off the second webinar of this series titled Resilience for Youth, Working with Traumatized Immigrant Children. Today's presentation is led by Chloe Walker, Senior Staff Attorney with the American Bar Association Children's Immigration Law Academy, also known as CILA, Dr. Louise Zayas, Dean of the Steve Hicks School of Social Work and the Robert Lee Sutherland Chair in Mental Health and Social Policy at the University of Texas, and Dr. Jody Berger Cardoso, Associate Professor at the Graduate College of Social Work at the University of Houston. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website in September. PDFs of the slides will be emailed to those registered. Please ensure that you are muted. Please use the chat box to enter your questions and comments, and we will get them answered during the Q&A sections. If you are on the phone, please hold your question until the end of the presentation. Thanks for being here and enjoy.
Thank you so much to Naseem and to HILSC for inviting CILA to participate in this entire webinar series and to present on today's webinar. We're also really excited, I'm also really excited to work with today's presenters who have such depth of experience and knowledge working with children from the mental health lens. As you all may be aware, children in the deportation system have no right to a government-appointed attorney or a best interest advocate, even when they're going before a judge alone. And the organizations that do provide free legal services and best interest advocacy, some of which may be on the call today, are certainly not able to help all of the children that are in deportation proceedings. So as advocates, we must let the government institutions that immigrant children interact with not forget that they are children and teenagers and not little adults. So this webinar is going to build on our first one in the series that presented on trauma-informed lawyering and help equip attorneys to do just that, to work with children and work with the court system to ensure protections for children in the deportation system. So Dean Zayas is going to present on the journey that children make to the United States in addition to the harmful impacts of detention and family separation. Dr. Berger Cardoso is going to give information on creating safe spaces and working with mental health professionals. And I'm going to touch briefly on some of the challenges in creating safe spaces within the ORR detention system. So without further ado, I am going to pass the screen over to Dean Zayas.
Okay, trying to open this up, pardon me. There. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today and be able to provide some of my experience and insights on how detention, family separation impacts the mental health of children who are here seeking asylum with their families. What I'd like to cover today is talk about the levels of trauma that children suffer in the process of coming to the United States. First, is the trauma that they experience in their home countries. You know, the presence of gangs and violence, police complicity and inaction, government ineffectiveness, rapes, assault, extortion, kidnapping, and so on that they experience in their home countries. Speak something about the in-transit trauma, what happens to them during the trek through Mexico into the United States, and then what happens in what I call post-trauma migration trauma, the hieleras and the detention centers that are all around us now, it seems. We all know about what happens back in their home countries. There's a great deal of death and violence in the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And we know about them. We've heard about the gangs, the kidnappings, and so on. Among the children that I had an opportunity to interview was a 7-year-old boy by the name of Danny. Danny drew some pictures for me while I was interviewing him at the Karnes family detention facility in Karnes, Texas. In this drawing, 7.5-year-old Danny was telling me about the community, the Rebos Locos, as he called them. And these were the gang members in the area. As you can see in this drawing, the son is horrified by what's happening. Danny marks here that the stick figure in the middle has a handgun, armas de fuego, and is smoking a cigarette. That's what made him a bad guy, that he held a gun and he smoked cigarettes. And some of the things they did was they just terrorized people and killed some. As you see in the bottom right, there is someone in what appears to be a coffin. And
Gaius, for some reason, we can only see half of the PowerPoint screen.
half of the PowerPoint screen.
Yes. There we go.
Oh, okay. Are you still seeing the full or the half?
We see that. We see the full now.
Okay. I don't know what happened there, but all right. Very well. So that was the first drawing. And this is a young boy who had been traumatized by the experience. His family fled after he had been beat up by some of the gang members. Remember, he's 7 years old at the time. This is what happened on the day that really caused his family to flee. So here in this drawing, Danny shows me the day his uncle was murdered by the gang members. At the on the left is a person who is bloodied from the head. He writes, "That's mi tío," his uncle. And Danny tells me that he was at home and he heard that his uncle had been killed. So he ran to his uncle's house. They apparently lived near enough to themselves and his abuelos at the top of the little mountain there. And he told me that he saw his uncle's dead body and the blood coming out of his head, and he's seeing his uncle's teeth coming out of the back of his head. This is the kind of horror story that I heard lots of, and in this case, Danny drew for me. So the family, that happened, and then several months later was when Danny was beat up by one of those same men who killed his uncle. At the bottom right is his family. He had an older brother that left with them, but his mother and his father were traumatized by the death and then by the assault on Danny, and so they decided to flee. However, they couldn't go very far because if you notice there, mi papa down in the right-hand corner is a single amputee. He has a crutch and only one leg. He couldn't travel the rugged terrain with his wife and sons. So he said to his wife, save our sons, go. So Danny, his brother, and his mother set off from Honduras and Danny told me all he could do was say goodbye to his father. Danny was in detention for all together about 5 months. This is back in 2014, 2015. And at that point had not seen his father since. That's the level of trauma that these children experience in their home countries. Now, in the migration through Mexico, we have seen that, well, I have been told by many families that one of the problems is not just the dangers of coyotes and criminal and organized gangs, the violence, the intimidation, the physical and sexual assaults, sometimes the imprisonment and deprivation that happens. But one of the things that really troubled them is that they didn't know who they could trust. They don't know who they can trust. Can they trust this vendor who has food that they need to buy? Is he in cahoots with the local gang members? Can we trust a police officer? No, generally they cannot. And can we even trust a nice old lady by the church? They're constantly under this pressure and the tension of who can they trust as they find their way through Mexico to our southern border. So there's this constant danger and depravity that happens to them, both as a result of just highwaymen and the coyotes themselves who turn against them. Then we know what happens when they arrive at the United States. They're taken into custody by ICE or Customs and Border Protection. And one of their first stops is the hieleras. And I've been told about these many times by families that I have interviewed, both in detention and since detention. The hieleras, or ice boxes, are rooms, as you can see in these pictures, that in which 30 or so people are put in for about 72 hours initially when they're at their first day. And they are cold places. The air conditioning is intentionally left in the 50s. The lights are on for 24 hours a day. And the migrants are there with the same clothes they wore during their trek. They may be unbathed for days. They may be ill and untreated. They're hungry and given mere sandwiches and things like that. And as you see in these, there are the half walls in the back. Those are toilets. And there's only one toilet for these 30 people in this hieleras. And so whatever they do, they must do it in the presence of everyone else. Here they may separate the older boys from the families. So that's their first stop. And then of course, they go into the detention centers that have cropped up all over the United States, but particularly in the southern part of our country. And we have seen pictures like these in our newspapers and on television. Now, when a child is in detention, we're going to go to the psychological effects of detention. Already you know that there's the trauma of what happened in their countries and the difficult, stressful, traumatic experience of trekking roughly 1,800 miles from their home countries through Mexico to the United States. And two of the most toxic elements of detention are deprivation. That is the absence of developmentally appropriate environmental inputs and complexity. In detention, there are no bike rides in their neighborhoods. There is no walk to school with your buddies and girlfriends. There are no picnics. There are no field trips to petting zoos. It's a life of imprisonment where you are deprived of the experience that most normal children need to have, to be able to cross the street, to learn to look for signs of safety when they cross the street, look both ways, or going to the store, making change. All of the things that growing children need to develop their social skills, their intellectual skills, are all deprived and taken away from them. And that's part of the toxic element of detention. The other element is that of threat. The constant, pervasive threat to their psychological security and their physical integrity. The child is constantly worried about what will happen to me. And we do know that prison guards, because they are prison guards, although they're called detention centers, these prison guards are often frightening to children. They're large, looming people who are not necessarily kind to the children and will say things like, oh, you're going to be deported. Oh, you're never going to get out of here. Wait till you get out of here. You're going to be in trouble. So children are constantly being frightened and threatened by the environment around them. They don't know what's going to happen. They are uncertain about what their future will be. When I spoke to teenagers in the detention centers, one of their worries was, what's going to happen to my education? Will I ever move forward again? Or will my life be stunted here forever? And in fact, they have reason to be worried. And those are the two essential elements of the detention experience that really traumatizes children. In both the research that I have seen, the clinical work I have done, and the research that I'm doing now on children who have spent time in detention facilities, we have seen, and it's been reported, high levels of clinical depression. We're talking about major depressive disorders reactive to being in detention. We're talking about layers of trauma, right? We're talking about the original trauma of their country and the most recent one of their trek through Mexico, and of course, the detention center. So I focus on what detention is doing to them. And they talk about the depression of being locked up. Because of the deprivation of just the normally expected experiences, they become suicidal. They begin to think about suicide, especially the older children, and engage in self-harm. We begin to see emotional disturbances, dissociative experiences. We see things like bedwetting and regressions in behavior, voluntary starvation, sleep disturbances, whether insomnia or hypersomnia, where kids all they want to do is sleep. They complain about physical ailments. It hurts here, it hurts there. And we've seen anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder in these children. And the boredom, the extreme sadness, the hopelessness is part of that, the dehumanization of detention and what it does to children that harms their well-being and their mental health. As I mentioned, we have seen regressions in behavior. An 11-year-old boy who reverted to bedwetting, what we call secondary enuresis, nocturnal enuresis, bedwetting, after having been continent for years. And an 8-year-old girl who regressed to insisting that her mother breastfeed her. This is the kind of deprivation and dehumanization that occurs in depression that leaves these children with just layers and layers of stress and disturbance. Now, we saw last summer, 2018, that the government instituted the family separation policy, the zero tolerance policy in which children were separated. That added yet another level of harm to asylum-seeking children and families. We do know that family separation, when a child is suddenly torn, especially the younger ones who are just forming that strong attachment bond to their primary caregiver, typically the mother, when they're forming that, we saw last summer that they were torn apart from their families. That attachment and bonding process was suddenly disrupted, torn, and children were separated for days, weeks, and even months. Now, we do know that when a child is with the parent, and especially at reunification, they will sense the parent's tension, the anxiety, the depression that the mother had. It's transmitted emotionally. It's not obviously transmitted in words. And we do know that adverse events during these sensitive periods of development will shape how their brain development occurs. What happens to their brain, to the neurobiology of brain development. I'll come back to that in a little bit. So this disruption in the attachment affects their socio-emotional development, their cognition, their language, and their health. Now, I'm about to show you a video that appeared on television and on the internet, and you've probably all seen it. But what I want you to point out is that how a young child's attachment is affected. Now, attachment, again, a secure attachment is when the child, lunges into their parents' arms for a hug upon reuniting. It's like when you leave your child with a babysitter and you get back from the movie date with your spouse, and the child comes to you and reunites and you envelop them, the child in your arms. That's secure attachment. They look for you. In the case of impaired attachment that's caused by the separation, we have several forms of attachment, reactive attachment disorders. One of them is insecure avoidance, where the child avoids the parent, doesn't feel secure in the connection to their parent. They expect the rejection of the parent, and as a consequence, they reject the parent and avoid the parent. You will see in this video a reunification of a young child to his mother after about 3 months of separation in separate detention centers. What's important to watch is how she wants to reunite with him. He goes away from her. Now, he had spent more time with his father than with his mother, and he goes towards his father. But as he does, he still avoids his father. This child is really experiencing a serious reactive attachment disorder, one that we would call insecure avoidance, and watch the video here. It's hard to watch. I've watched this dozens of times, and it's always hard to watch. But you see that the little boy doesn't know what to do. His attachment has been so disrupted. He doesn't know. He may have some recognition that that's his mother, but he may feel like she abandoned him. Of course, she didn't. It was government enforced. But he cannot connect with her. He cannot connect to her because he doesn't hit her, as you know. He just simply wants to be away from her. He expects more rejection, so he avoids her and goes away. Another reactive attachment disorder is what we call insecure ambivalent. This child is also insecure about his attachment and his mother's love for him. And in this video that I'm going to show you, it's an older child who's more verbal. And essentially, he had been separated from his mother. They had been put in separate detention centers. I don't know exactly the length of time that they were separated, but it was substantial enough that he felt that she had abandoned him. So in this case, this boy is showing a different attachment reaction. He's uncertain of his caregiver's affection. Does she really love him? He's angry, he's resistant to her because he really thinks she abandoned him and he wants to go somewhere else because he doesn't feel that he's safe anymore, that she could really abandon him at almost any moment. And watch the video here.
Henry?
Nossa, essa coleção familiar para mim ia cambiar muito.
Another indication of what happens when you separate children from their families. And these are two young children, but that doesn't stop there. Older children suffer similar reactions, although they are cognitively more mature and will be able to recognize their parents and understand that it was not, that the parents did not abandon them, did not send them away. But nonetheless, it is very painful, as it is painful to watch these videos. Now, so what we know is that now this trauma, especially the one that's inflicted by being in detention and the hieleras and the treatment that they receive, the child's natural stress response have now been dysregulated, if you will. What happens is that our bodies turn on a natural stress response system, you know, the fight-flight experience, where our hypothalamus, our pituitary, and our adrenal glands secrete hormones to get us through the moment of stress, right? You know, your mouth gets dry, your heart palpitates, your palms get sweaty, your eyes dilate, all of these things that we associate with stress. Well, typically, when that stress subsides, so does our natural response system. But these children have now had that stress response system activated. But the problem is that it doesn't remit. It's unremitting. It continues on. They're feeling deprivation and threat and fear and worry of separation. And it does begin to affect those regions and functions in the brain that regulate cognition, intellect, self-regulation, social interaction, trust, you name it. All of those functions are now truncated or stunted or affected in some way. And we do know that as we pile on adversity upon adversity, children's outcomes, mental health outcomes diminish, become impaired. Children will experience this diminished hope. The expectations for the future are diminished by the fact that they've been in detention and they still don't know what will happen to them. Will they be returned to their country? Now they're hearing through the newspapers and TV that it's possible that families will be kept in detention indefinitely. Imagine what that's doing to children who are already inside, that they may be detained for long periods of time. Perhaps those who have been released may fear that they will be returned. So there's additional trauma being inflicted on these children even as we speak. So we do know that there are long-term effects of migration and this aggressive immigration enforcement system. As I mentioned, there's the effects on the child's brain development, especially the younger ones, where those important sensitive developmental periods are occurring and their brain is taking shape. Times when they need they need challenges, they need experiences that will challenge them, that will extend their learning and their development. And instead, we are truncating that experiences. So what we do know is these children grow up and continue on with this hypervigilance, the constant dread of arrest and deportation. Families will not seek health care, will avoid child care, food stamps. They experience economic hardship and housing instability because they cannot keep their homes. We do know that it really affects a child's developmental trajectory. I haven't spoken a lot about the parents, but they too are affected, of course. Now, they are adults, they understood more of what they've gotten themselves into. But our work, and Dr. Berger Cardoso will talk more about it, is how do we help those families? How do we bring those children back together with their families when an attachment disorder has emerged, when those children have been traumatized and their mental health has been impaired, when parents' own mental health is deeply affected by the separation and the disruption that's caused by detention. One of the problems that comes also from the possibility of deportation is that a child doesn't understand where they belong. They don't belong in their country of origin because that's unsafe. They're not wanted there. They know that if they go back, they will be killed or someone in their families will be killed. Like Danny's father, we don't know. What have those gang members done to his father? Did they take retribution on him for his family's departure, or did they leave him alone? We don't really know. But that sense, the child cannot return there, even though his father's there in Danny's case. But they also don't feel that they're welcomed or belong in this country. And they're essentially children who feel stateless as they grow up. And again, we do know that they worry about the effects of detention, of being feared that they're going to be returned. We see children with nightmares and night terrors. As I mentioned, bedwetting. There's all sorts of images that they carry with them about detention. And we have seen the numbness, the dissociative experiences when they dissociate, when they go numb and their minds blank out and can't really think or try to numb the experience of the trauma that they've suffered. They constantly feel a shattered sense of safety and well-being. We will see, with this adversity piling on, these children, especially those who will not receive adequate mental health care, we will see the development of mental health issues, mental illness into adulthood, anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, problems with interpersonal relationships, possibly antisocial behavior, and isolation, so that they're unable to trust and therefore do not engage with others. And we do know that that kind of stress also leads to chronic illnesses in adulthood, cardiovascular disorders, diabetes, asthma, obesity. Many of these will be chronic results of what happened to the children during their early life. And with that, I will stop there and take your questions if there are any at this point. Thank you very much.
So if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask directly to Dean Zayas.
Luis, this is Gladys. I work with an organization that trains volunteers to meet with the kids while they're still in custody. And the kids sometimes are separated from the parents, sometimes they just came unaccompanied. And one of the questions we frequently get is how much to engage when the kids are beginning to, how much the volunteer should engage with the kid when the kid is beginning to just like withdraw and not want to engage with volunteers because of their trauma.
When you say engage, just talk in general?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like sometimes we get our volunteers assigned to, say, like a 5-year-old, right, who was separated here in Arizona at the border, and the kid just doesn't want to engage. Maybe they're afraid that of being abandoned again, or what the case may be. And so like we often struggle like as child advocate supervisors on how to tell the volunteers how to manage that, right? When the kid is doing that, like, I don't want to engage.
Well, you know, the first principle is don't force it, right? You tell your staff, your volunteers, don't force them. Bring out papers. The younger the child, the more likely they are to play and draw. Give them crayons and paper, as I did with Danny. You know, draw what happened to you in your country. Now, that was Danny. He was in detention, so he was older. But a younger child, just draw. The colors they're going to pick will be theirs. And for the volunteer to comment on, "Ooh, that's a pretty flower," or "That's a nice this or that," positive comments, of course, will engage the child. Playing with dolls or cars or getting on the floor with the child without pressing anything. Nothing about what happened, why you're here, what happened to you in detention, what happened to you on the trek to Mexico. Nothing. Just, you know, using the child's name and playing and letting them take the drawings with them, right? So that they can have something that they can carry with them and return the next time to be seen. In time, we hope that child will engage. Another means may be to do parent-child interaction work, right? Bring them together to have the parent, and most often it's mothers, as we know that they're the ones more likely to bring the children to appointments, that they too can engage with the child. And the child will likely be able to speak to them even with the volunteer present, that they can listen in. But the volunteer should not force the issue or force themselves, but be a bystander, a participant, observer, and participate only as the child allows him or her in. That's really the best means. I might add to that for your volunteers and your therapists who might be more engaged with the families, is that we're going to have to peel back the layers of trauma one at a time. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that really the most recent trauma is that of the detention. And I think that's the one that is harmful with respect to feeling integrated into the community that they're now living in, where they can feel that they really are a part, because they have been made to feel upon their arrival to this country that they're unwelcome, that they are some kind of pariah, that they are less than human. And our job is to help them overcome that trauma. The trauma of the migration and what happened at home is something for much later. Right now, it's to help them adapt to the present, to their schools, to their communities. Most of them will not go to very wealthy communities. They'll go to, you know, kind of working class and low income communities. So we've got to help them feel safe, you know, try to help them feel like they belong to that, but understand what the dangers are, but that it's not necessarily directed to them. I think those are the sorts of things we need to do early on in the work with children. Older kids, when I did more therapy, I would engage at the level that they are. In my day, we didn't have a lot of video games, so I didn't play video games. But kids we would play board games, and the teenagers would bring in their guitars or whatever instrument they played, and they would play for me and sing songs, and we'd talk about the song, or they would read their poetry and things like that. It's at that level that we need to engage them. And I think older children, engaging them to journal their experience, because it will be valuable testimony for them for now and for the future as they grow. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you.
Deans, I have one more question for you. Without access to affordable or consistent mental health care, can these children overcome their attachment issues?
Yes, they can, but it takes extraordinarily sensitive parenting. It takes the capacity of a parent to understand that that this is a different child than the one they had before the separation. And I think that's critical. Some parents will understand that and be sensitive to it. Others may not. The parents may themselves have been so traumatized that they are having difficulty managing their child's trauma, and this reactive, attachment problem. It will take time. In time, the child will naturally, as the family spends more time together, they will reattach. But imagine it's like a broken bone that's not set properly. It will forever grow. It will forever grow kind of, with that break, kind of with the results of that break present. And so it may never be entirely worked through. I hope, though, however, that we can train enough volunteers, paraprofessionals, professionals to be prepared for these children, whether they're seeing them in free clinics in the basement of churches throughout our country, or in doctors' offices and at school with social workers and counselors, should be prepared to see them. That's where we might be able to do some of that work to repair the attachment. It will involve getting the parents in, and it means also working at hours, not the usual 9 to 5, because of course parents will be working to make a living to be able to feed their families, but in the evenings and on weekends when families are able to come to sessions. That is really what we can do, and there are ways of doing it. Without care, it really will require parents who are extremely sensitive to their children.
I think I have one thing to add to Dean Zayas's comment. It's to remember that there are various forms of family separation. And we need to acknowledge that not every form of separation may have the same impact. So we have children, for example, who have migrated after their parents. Their parents have been in the United States for a considerable amount of time and have been separated from their children for a few years, all the way up to a child doesn't have a cognitive recollection of that parent in their life. And I think the family separation and some of the things that Dean Zayas emphasized in the context of detention are critical and important. It's also critical and important to think about there are different kinds of separation, and a child's reaction may vary depending on the kind and the context of that separation, as to not sort of generalize in the sense that, children in detention may have one experience and children who have experienced separation because of serial migration may have a different experience. And I just wanted to point that out because we have a lot of kids. In fact, all of the unaccompanied minors generally that we talk about 91% of them are reunifying with parents. And that's a different kind of separation that might need to be treated in a different way.
Yes, thank you very much for making that point.
Yes. Am I next? Okay, so that's a good segue to me. Just a second. So again, my name is Jody Berger Cardoso, and I'm at the University of Houston. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about different kinds of strategies you can use when you're working with kids in the field. Some of these recommendations, in fact, most of these recommendations are outside of the context of detention. And my colleague Chloe is going to talk to you about some recommendations in the context of detention. And when possible, I'll try and make some suggestions as well. But it's important to talk about the idea of child-friendly spaces. This is a concept that was started many moons ago, mostly by UNICEF, in the context of emergencies and disasters. And so child-friendly spaces are structured spaces with age-appropriate activities that are culturally tailored with appropriate materials, and they have materials that engage and target all of the 5 senses. So Dean Zayas was talking about some of these materials, and I'm going to talk to you about some of these materials. But in the context of an office or an attorney's suite, some of these things can be brought in and can be made available to kids, both as you interview them for their declarations, but also as they wait and you talk to their parents, to sort of decrease the stress that occurs in children when they know they're going to have to talk about some of the most difficult aspects of their life. Child-friendly spaces I've seen in legal settings and have been very impressed by the kinds of materials that attorneys can bring into their firms. Some of those include fidget spinners and stress balls, Play-Doh, water beads, sand trays, anything that's tactile that a child can touch and caress as they're talking to you about their experiences. Of course, markers, and I always think the ones with a cent or a plus because they serve two purposes. You know, you can draw, instructing the kids to draw, to use the pens and papers. I oftentimes in an evaluation will ask the kid, tell me about a memory in your country. Tell me about something that you want me to know that I wouldn't know unless you put it on paper. And so allowing kids to use markers with scents, if you're able to sort of document their life. Of course, Dean Zayas talked about some of these other materials like stuffed animals, paying attention to the way they feel. I always like to use very gender and very sex specific toys. So I like animals, of course, because many stuffed animals are non-gender specific. And then seating that is child friendly. I know many of you have gone into detention centers as I have, and detention center seating is the most uncomfortable experience that exists. In fact, it's oftentimes very difficult for me to concentrate on a case in detention because I am a fidgeter and can't get comfortable and can't bring anything inside except pen and paper. And so, you know, when you have kids that are released into the community and they're going to come into your office and you're going to take some of this information from them, having child-friendly seating is really critical to really developing that rapport. I think also creating safety by prioritizing the interpersonal relationship. I think this is really important. It's something that we learn first and foremost in social work education, but that may be very discipline specific. If you really want to obtain the story or the narrative, or to understand the child's needs, here are some key things that you can do. Be transparent. Describe the interview process, the expectations, and observe the time. I know it's really hard to plan multiple visits, but it's very developmentally unfriendly and very trauma uninformed to expect a child to give you their whole narrative in one setting. And so I really try and practice what I preach by letting attorneys know that in a mental health evaluation, when I meet with a child, I really plan to meet with them for 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 sessions. I've had kids where I've met with them 5 times to get the narrative. And I know that that's really difficult, but that is the most child-friendly and child-focused way to do things. And so here's an example of how I might be transparent in my interactions, because I can't always meet with a kid for 4 times, right? You know, today we have to talk about some really hard things. It's really unfair that I have to ask you to talk about these things that you probably are really trying to forget. And I'm sorry that I have to do this in order to help you stay here. But today we're going to be here for 60 minutes. And if things get too hard when we're talking or when we're drawing or when we're sharing in your experience, we can take breaks. So you just tell me. So that's really kind of setting up the structure of the interview for the child or the interaction, and having them understand, especially in the context of detention and post-detention, having a child understand the structure and the predictability of the experience really helps them feel safe. Then it's really critical to demonstrate empathy. So once a child discloses something that was really hard, take a moment, stop the interview, acknowledge the difficult experience, and acknowledge that that child has survived. It was really brave of you to tell me this. I know you don't know me well, and it's really not easy to talk to strangers. I can see you were brave to survive, and now you put in the child's name. You are showing me your bravery right here in this interview. Thank you for sharing that. So really taking time away from asking question after question, which can really dysregulate or really, you know, create problems for a child to regulate the stress involved in telling you their story or their emotions if they don't feel safe and heard. And empathy is a way to do that. And then using skills like summarizing and reflecting. You know, I really heard you say these things happen to you, and you've said a lot, but I want to highlight some of the things that I think were especially hard for you to survive. And that's a really important skill, because that lets the child know that you're listening to what they're saying. And the degree that you can summarize that in language that they understand and in their own words, that's really going to reinforce that they feel heard. Okay, there we go. Also, creating safety by prioritizing the interpersonal interaction includes managing your own nonverbal communication. I know we don't think about this, but I used to sit in front of a mirror and practice my entry-level conversations with kids and families, because having grown up in New Orleans in a very mixed Cajun, French, Jewish family, I've realized that we don't have very good poker faces. And so I wear a lot of what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling. And you can tell by the way I'm giving this presentation that I'm also very expressive. So I really want to prepare my body and my face and my whole disposition to be ready to hear the stories in a non-reactive way. And even the slightest twitch of emotion or diversion of eye contact at the wrong time can send a message to the child that you don't want to send. So if the child's talking about a sexual assault and you are looking at them and then you start looking at the floor, what does that communicate to the child? Or if you look surprised that that happened to them, then they're feeling like this is something unique to only them. And maybe they're feeling like they don't want to tell you the 3 things that are even worse than the thing they just told you. So really paying attention to your nonverbal communication. I have to also pay attention to the tone of my voice, because I can be very loud and verbose. So just paying attention to how your voice sounds when you yourself sound stressed. Are you experiencing fear and stress in the interview? Are you feeling stressed about detention, and how you may unintentionally communicate that in your interactions with a kid? And are you anticipating the trauma narrative? I mean, I know now I've interviewed 50 to 60 kids. And so sometimes I'm anticipating something, and that's really not what this child has experienced. And so really trying to enter each interview with a clean slate, if you will, ready to let the child, the adolescent, and the parent kind of explore and describe their journey with you. And some of the ways that I do that is to regulate my own emotions before I go into an interview, if possible. I do this in detention a lot. I have all kinds of tricks of the trade that I share with attorneys. One of the things that I do is I listen to really loud heavy metal music. It clears out my head. I mean, you know, each person is going to have different ways to sort of regulate their emotions. And I not only do I do that when possible before I go into an interview, but I do that between interviews as well. And in detention, of course, I can't bring in my iPad with my headphones and listen to heavy metal. But, you know, I use the caps of my pens. I use different strategies with touch and the paper that I bring in to try and really ground myself and prepare my body and my mind to be ready for the next challenge. And then when possible, encourage self-efficacy and agency. This is incredibly important with children, especially those who have been detained. You know, they don't have any control over their situation, and they feel very powerless. And then you're actually requiring them to participate in a process that unfortunately is not very trauma-informed and child-friendly sometimes. And so to the degree possible, giving that child their own efficacy, their own agency. We have to talk about your life in Honduras today, the journey about how you got here, and all the things that have gone on since your arrival. Which one of these things do you want to talk about first? It's a real simple way of giving them agency, even if it's in the context of detention. Hello? Can you still hear me or see me? Because I somehow did something to my screen. So I can only see a few of you.
Yes, we can see.
Okay. Perfect. So then there's the issue of building rapport. And I use this picture of myself just to give you some background. I recently went to McAllen and Brownsville with a group of people, some of whom were from the University of Texas. And we were in bus stations working with families, children and families who were recently released from ICE, and they were in Catholic Charities respite centers, and they were on their way to the next stop in their journey. And I was sitting down on the floor with a map, really just mapping for them. You are in Texas, and this is where Brownsville is, and you are in you were going to go to first to Alabama and then to Miami and then to really mapping out the journey. And you can see in this picture that the people are actually sitting above me, that I am on the ground and I am looking up at them. And this is just a basic way to communicate some humility in your interactions. I do this with kids, even in my office. I move all over the chairs and I sit on the ground with them, and I sit on one side of the wall and they sit on the other side of the wall. And it just kind of levels the interaction so that the person feels like you're not talking down to them, you're talking with them. And this is just a simple way to do that. Remember that when you are interviewing and interacting with kids, you really need to think about how you communicate your cultural humility. And this is a process that whether you're, non-Hispanic white as myself, or you yourself are Latinx, or you come from a different cultural orientation, these are things that we must keep in mind when we're interviewing children and families. Cultural humility is a process that one engages to build insight about their individual privilege and oppression while learning about the different multicultural perspectives. While you and I may not agree with the policies that are coming out of the current administration, we somehow represent that to some of these families. And so acknowledging that, you share many of their concerns and that you're sorry that this is their experience upon entering the United States. One of the simple things that I said to people as they were leaving to get on the bus is, you may hear differently, but welcome to the United States. We're happy to have you here. And so that just communicates some humility. Requiring openness and professional growth and entering the situation from the perspective of the learner. Even with all of my experience, I'm constantly aware of some of the mistakes that I make, one of which I made on this past trip to the border, where there was a young child. He was 2.5 years old. He was male. And I had a real reaction to this child because I have a son who's 2.5, who's male, and who is also Hispanic. And so he was crying and he was distressed, and I went to put my arm to touch his arm to comfort him, and he reacted to me. And it was a reminder that I don't necessarily represent safeness to this child, and really being aware of when you reach out to comfort children and their families, and under what context you may offer that kind of comfort is really important for you to think about. That's just one example. But also, we have cultural expectations about what it means to be a child in the United States. And I've really had to challenge my thinking about this, especially as I work with young adolescents from Guatemala and other areas of Central America, where in their culture and in their community, they were perceived as adults. And so being treated without agency and self-efficacy is really difficult for many of these young adults. And so really acknowledging that, even though the system sees them as a child, recognizing that in their own culture, they may not have been perceived as such. And again, being on the child's level, and even in detention, you can challenge the setup to do this. Strategies for interviewing children. These are a couple of examples. I love to use feeling charts. These are on Amazon. They're like $5. Really giving, and they come in Spanish, English, Arabic. They really give kids an opportunity to express themselves in other ways. I use flashcards to help kids understand chronology of events. So tell me the most important events on your life on these cards, and order them in a way that helps me understand what happened first. So instead of saying in 1995, what happened to you, helping them, detail and orient themselves to their stories by chronology, using more exploratory and artistic ways. And then again, I talked about using some of the, the smelly markers to help them feel centered when kids get very distressed. I will say, why don't we take a minute and smell something together? So we remind ourselves that this isn't happening to you right now. This is something that's happened in the past. Focus on the smell of this marker to remind yourself that you're in a safe place. And then water beads and kinds of things that they can hang on to as you're meeting with them. A few other strategies: when possible, meet with the parent first to understand the child's experience, learn key aspects of their personality, their likes and dislikes. Consider how the declaration will impact the child's mental health. So if the child is dysregulated and symptomatic, meaning they're depressed or they have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, consider taking the declaration after the child has started therapy. I've had this come up a couple of times with attorneys in the field, where a child has disclosed sexual abuse and the parent is unaware of the sexual abuse. And as a social worker, I have specific laws that I need to follow that govern my license. And so I'm always trying to think strategically. If I know a child has been assaulted, if I know there's physical abuse, making sure that that child is already set up with a mental health practitioner in the community, so that that child has a space to become regulated after they're talking to me. Of course, I talked to you about the multiple visit approach. Try not to push your time-based agenda. I've said to kids, hey, if this becomes too much, tell me it's time to stop. What do you want to be your safe word? And we talk about what a safe word is. And sometimes a kid can make it through 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and they're done. And I have to respect that for them, because they have to go back into the world, and I have to make sure that they can be in a safe space to do that. Using soft eyes, meaning don't stare at the child indefinitely. Look at them and then have some spaces where you look away. Although be aware when you're looking away and making sure that that's not because of your own discomfort. So just observing the intensity of your eye contact. And I often practice and do that in the mirror. As somebody who considers themselves kind of an intense person, that's often been a strategy that works for me. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and let my colleague Chloe come in and share some of her insight with you.
Thanks, Jody. I'm just going to get my slide up on the screen. Here it is. Is it? Okay. Y'all can see my note slides, right? But basically what I'm about to talk about when I share my screen is, I know there are a lot of folks on the call who work with unaccompanied children who, by nature of being unaccompanied children, are going through the ORR detention system, which is a little bit different than the Border Patrol and the family detention scenario. So there's not some of the super complex challenges that we have in those settings, but there are some challenges that might present themselves. And so I just wanted to kind of talk briefly about those challenges, although thank you, Dr. Berger-Cardoso, for sharing so many thoughtful examples that I really think you can use in any setting. So I'm going to start from my current slide. Okay, great. So I just wanted to first start off thinking about this overall journey, to kind of continuing what Dean Zayas was talking about before in terms of what is the journey that the child is making once they arrive in the United States. And that, actually currently now, before the child even gets here, there is this process that's taking place on the southern side of the border called metering. And so there's this widespread practice of a list that's created before someone can even enter the United States. And I've got a picture up here, which is actually from Dr. Berger-Cardoso's recent trip that she was just talking about. She shared with me, that's the list, I believe, of names. And with unaccompanied children, sometimes they're not even making it on this list. And there are reports that they're being detained by child welfare in Mexico and being deported. So there are children that are not even making it across the border, but once they do make it across the border, they're apprehended by CBP, as Dean Zayas talked about before. And then for unaccompanied children, they are transferred out of that Border Patrol facility into an Office of Refugee Resettlement facility. And again, to the extent that a child is separated from their parent or caregiver, as was talked about before, they will be funneled into this, this system, the ORR system. And even someone who was traveling perhaps with an adult caregiver that's not their parent or their legal guardian, so they might be traveling with an adult sibling or a grandparent, they may also be separated at the border, and they would also flow into this system for unaccompanied children and ORR. And children that are not separated from their parents go through the family detention system, which is subject to these rules that were just released. The administration is looking to try and detain children with their parents indefinitely. So on the ORR side of things, when they're transferred to the ORR shelter, the goal is to stay there for as long as they can be reunified with a parent or other relative. Like Dr. Berger-Cardoso mentioned, 91% of kids are reunified with a parent out of the ORR shelter in the country. And there's also these influx facilities that we've seen pop up all over the country that open when there are an influx of the number of unaccompanied children crossing the border. So that would be like the facility in Homestead, the one in Tornillo that was open last year, one that was briefly open in Carrizo Springs. And those are not state licensed. They're opened in emergencies. And as of the date of this recording, there are no children in any of the influx facilities, but they are still open. So a child might be passing through both an ORR shelter and an influx facility, one or the other. They're all going to look really different before they're ultimately released to a sponsor, deported, put into long-term foster care if they have no sponsor, but they have legal relief. Or if they turn 18, they're sometimes transferred directly into ICE detention or released on recognizance if they're about to turn 18. So there's lots of, I just wanted to highlight this to show that there are so many different possible scenarios in which you might be working with a child in this context. We do know that in the CBP facilities, there is no access for attorneys or mental health professionals. Family detention also comes with its own set of restrictions. I don't even think at one point there was a limitation on bringing crayons and things like that into family detention centers. But so just to frame what I'm going to be talking about in the next couple of slides is the ORR system, which are the 170 facilities around the country in 23 states that children are transferred through when they're identified as an unaccompanied child. There's been about 61,000 unaccompanied children that have passed through this system so far this year. And also wanted to point out that there are several different kinds of ORR shelters. So what kind of a shelter a child will go to depends on an initial screening, which includes things like demographics, their age, their gender, whether they have siblings with them, whether they're deemed to be an escape risk or a danger to the community. So they might be going into a shelter facility. They might be going into a staff secure or a secure facility. Or they might be going into an influx facility. There's just a lot of different options, or a foster care situation. So, and And even within the shelters, on the far left is a picture of a senator in front of the OR shelter in South Texas that is the converted Walmart. So there's 1,400 kids in that one, but there are other shelters that are much smaller. This middle picture is from a juvenile detention center, a staff secure setting in California. And the last slide is from another shelter here in Texas. Right. So sharing all that to say that you might not have much control if you're not in your own office working with a child over that space. You're going to be working in someone else's space, and you're going to be working with several different systems in order to try and create these spaces where you can have these conversations with children and gather really important information that you need for their legal case. So here are some considerations that are really, just reflecting on the things that Dr. Berger Cardoso already shared. But one challenge that folks have reported that they have in OR facilities is securing confidential space. And to back up a little bit, so this is really going to come up in the context for those folks that are working at organizations that have access to OR shelters. So that would be the legal service organizations or the organizations that run the shelters themselves. They're all licensed in the state where they're located. So you have to go through all of the state licensing background checks, et cetera. And so there might be opportunities through the organizations if you don't work for them, but generally speaking, you can't just show up. So having access to these facilities really goes through the professionals that are hired to work in them. But securing confidential space, even when you work for one of those organizations, can sometimes be a challenge. So this, I think, really comes from the relationships that you build with the systems that you're working in. So whether it's the shelter staff itself or the family field specialists that work with ORR, communicating in advance and building those relationships between your organizations to explain exactly why you need this confidential space. And, if you really need to, I know that there are times, for example, Dr. Berger Cardoso has shared that if she's doing a forensic evaluation, requesting transportation to actually take the child somewhere else to create that environment that you really need in order to be able to do your job. So, this is a necessary part of the job, and it's something that, folks should feel comfortable having that conversation with the folks that are in charge of the space and in charge of the kids and know their schedules and things like that. Again, to the extent that you're going into a shelter or going into family detention or any other space, it's really, really important to clarify that even though you're in that space, you don't work for that organization, you don't work for the shelter, you don't work for the government. You are a lawyer or a social worker or an advocate, and you work for a particular organization, and that's what your role is. And you might have to do that every single time that you go into that space, because it'll be very confusing because you are just showing up, amidst all the other activities that might be happening that day in the shelter. So you really need to make that clear. And I've seen, there's organizations in Texas that will, everybody has the same fleece. That has, like ProBar has their blue ProBar fleeces, or Catholic Charities in Houston, they all have the lanyards around their neck. So it's kind of a way to identify themselves as, being from the same organization, but a different organization than the shelter. Like Dr. Berger Cardoso said, you probably will need to meet with a child several times, especially if you're going to be working with them on their legal case. And that's really going to involve proactive communication with the shelter staff. And it might require, some additional legwork in terms of logistics, but it's important because, you need to create that time and space for the child to build rapport and share the information that you need. Again, the schedules might be complicated. They might be out on a field trip or something like that. So you just want to make sure that you plan ahead, and that you're also careful about not making promises that are out of your control that you might break. As Dr. Berger Cardoso mentioned earlier, that sense of trust and that sense of autonomy over what's going on You might really lose that trust if you say, hey, I'm going to meet with you every Tuesday, but you don't really have control over that. And again, building rapport is something you're going to have to do no matter what, but especially in the OR facilities, you do have some room to bring in those types of tools that Dr. Cardoso mentioned, the stuffed animals, the spinners, the markers, the paper, things like that. You might have to have a kind of a mobile situation, but it's still a possibility. So there are challenges, but and it's not ideal, but we do live in a system where children have access to an attorney at the OR shelters, and it may be their last time to talk to an attorney or even a mental health professional who works for the shelter itself. So how do we take advantage of these situations and make it as safe as possible? Also recognizing that it's not, that the best space is actually somewhere else. And I'll pass it back to Jody.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about when to request a psychological evaluation. And Nasim, you guys can hear me, right? And see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
But
because
can you
again,
share
I
your
can't
screen?
see any of you. All I now see is my screen. Okay, that's fine.
Can you
When
share
you,
your screen with us?
oh, I haven't shared it. Let's see. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about when to request a psychological evaluation. I have been working in collaboration with a number of people, which I'll point reference to at the end of these slides, about when, like, what clients need a psychological evaluation and under what conditions do you request one from a mental health professional. And so this list is not entirely complete, but these are some ideas that we've been playing with. The first is when the client is having a hard time with the facts or the chronology of events related to the trauma. This is very typical with kids because kids don't remember time in the same way. You don't actually develop that ability cognitively until middle to late adolescence. So, but in any regard, kids, adolescents, even adults may have memory of their trauma that is very fragmented. And so it may take a lot of time and skill getting the chronology of the trauma and the facts of the trauma. In those cases, it is helpful to have a mental health professional do that. It is almost inevitable when I have conducted mental health evaluations that there is an aspect of the trauma history that I elicit that the lawyer doesn't know about. And it's just because I'm trained to elicit that trauma narrative in a way that is sensitive to the fragmentation of memory. Also, when the individual, when the trauma is psychological and there's limited evidence, if you will, that the trauma occurred. So if if there's been report of a rape, but the child or the parent or the young adult did not go to the hospital, then you want documentation that the psychological symptoms are consistent with someone who may have experienced that event. Also, when the severity and intensity of the psychological symptoms are so severe and that the individual cannot regulate to get through the trauma narrative without being in extreme stress. So, I mean, we've seen children urinate on themselves when they begin to talk about the trauma. We've seen them, kids will have, and adults even, will have panic attacks. They'll start to have tightness in their chest. They'll start to not be able to breathe. Some will become mute. They'll try and talk, but the sounds won't leave their mouth. Some will feel like they're suffocating and they can't breathe. In these cases, it is helpful to have a mental health evaluation because it may not be possible for that person to testify in court because the stress of that may be too much. Or even though you prep that client to talk about things in a certain way, they may not be able to do that without experiencing severe extreme stress. Also, I have been called in to do mental health evaluations when there have been hypotheses or even confirmed cognitive limitations in the child or adolescent or in the adult. Like I have been, I've done considerable work with Raices and YMCA International, going into detention centers to evaluate adults who have been deemed incompetent by the court. And I've also recently written some competency evaluations for children who may not be able to describe and talk in their own asylum interview. So I think in those cases, a psychological evaluation can be really critical because the documentation of those cognitive limitations and issues of competency can be challenged before the interview is denied, or before the asylum interview is denied and the child has to go to court. How can you help assist a mental health professional in conducting an evaluation? First and foremost, I think provide the mental health professional with an understanding of the kind of relief that is being sought. So is this an asylum hearing? Is this a special immigrant juvenile case? Is this, you know, a child that is going to qualify for a trafficking visa or a victim of a crime visa? So really being able to talk to the mental health professional about the kind of immigration relief that's being sought. And I understand, and I've learned in this process that can be challenging because you can go for multiple kinds of relief at the same time. But I think just being able to communicate that, because that informs the kind of content that goes in the report. I think be strategic about the timeline. Balance getting the evaluation closer to the arrival of the client when the symptoms are likely severe so that they can be documented, but also taking into account the client's state of mind. Are they too fragile or too symptomatic to recount the trauma? Would it be helpful to have them in some therapy so that they can regulate their emotions and they can feel safe when they describe the trauma to the mental health evaluator? Evaluations take time. Plan ahead as much as possible. I have been called on some last minute cases, but many cases are not last minute, particularly in the current overworked immigration court docket. So I think it's possible to plan ahead for these mental health evaluations. Have a sense of what you need help documenting. Is it the mental health symptoms? Is it the events? Is it the hardship of deportation or the anticipated persecution? So I've been called in to talk about the hardship of deportation on children who are US citizens. I've also been called in to talk about the anticipated persecution of someone with a severe mental illness being deported back to countries of origin. So really know what is it that you need help documenting. And then whenever possible, please provide other kinds of documentation. When I can triangulate my clinical observations and my opinion with other kinds of documentation, it makes a very strong, a much stronger case. So when there's evidence in the home country, when there's medical evidence in the home country, when there's psychiatric evaluations that have been done, either emergency psych evaluations or counseling letters that can be written in collaboration with my evaluation, case notes from inside of detention. I know ORR is very difficult, but they see mental health professionals inside. Some of them document some of this trauma. Some of them use validated psychometric instruments that can speak to the level of post-traumatic stress disorder. So requesting these files and having access to this. I have had trouble documenting this also for adults in detention, getting documentation for these folks who are in psych holes in detention. All of this is very critical. I'm sorry, my dog is barking. I hope you can't hear it. Finally, what kind of professional do you ask? The answer to this question is driven by what you need the person to do and whether or not they will need to testify. So like a licensed professional counselor, a licensed professional counselor can speak to some of the trauma in the context of counseling. A master social worker can talk about, can do a credible fear interview. Medical providers can document physical trauma. Psychiatrists can document medical needs to regulating symptoms. Nasim, you guys can hear me? Nasim,
Yes, we can hear you.
can you hear my dog? I'm sorry.
Yes, but it's okay. We can hear you.
Okay, if you just give me a second, let me let him out.
And what?
Go ahead.
I'm really sorry about that, but okay, so I'm back. So each of these different mental health providers can provide different,
Share your screen again.
yeah. Each of these mental health providers can provide different kinds of evidence for your case. So many licensed master social workers might go into detention and help prepare clients for credible fear interviews. But a clinical social worker can diagnose. This is much of the work that I do. So I can say these symptoms have likely created the onset of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I document those symptoms onto the disorder. And so the license piece or what you need the person to do and what they're capable of doing need to match up. Like I can't take physical pictures of torture and trauma. That needs to be a physician. I can't prescribe medication or talk about the neurocognitive effects of different medication on the brain. That's a psychiatrist. I can say that this client looks like they have significant limitations in cognition. And these are the cognitive areas, these are the social areas, these are the practical areas that I see limitations in this child. But I can't say that this child's IQ is this level and that indicates that they're borderline intelligence. That would be an educational psychiatrist or an educational psychologist. And then a country expert is going to speak to the conditions of the country. In Mexico, the condition for people with severe mental illness is this. In Honduras, this is what happens when people with severe mental illness are deported. It's really important that you ask the right person to do what it is that you need them to do. So I've been very careful not to act like a country expert because I don't really have that. I can't share that kind of evidence, and that evidence won't likely hold in testimony. So just being really careful about who you ask to do the work and their qualifications. So that's it for me. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Jody. Do we have any questions, Nasim?
We don't currently have any questions in the chat box, but if you have a question, we have just a couple minutes. You can either write it in the chat box or unmute your phone or computer to ask Jody or Dean Zayas or Chloe. Somebody asked, where can an MSW get training for CFI?
For taking
Because I'm
credible fear
guessing
interviews?
Yeah.
Nasim, do you want to talk about that? Because that corresponds with some of your initiatives at Hills.
Sure. So one of the leaders that is providing training on forensic evaluations is a national organization called Physicians for Human Rights. And they do hold trainings all over the country. And so depending on where you are, you can take a look at their website and look at their training calendar to see what they have available. Now, though it's physicians, and that's primarily how they began, they do also train licensed clinicians, licensed social workers. Now, given the influx of need for these types of evaluations, many cities across the state and across the country are providing these types of trainings done by seasoned clinicians who have worked primarily or with immigrants and around forensic evaluations for immigration cases. And so if you are in the Houston area or in Texas, you can email me, Naseem, at houstonimmigration.org, and I can let you know of potential trainings that are happening here. But definitely check with your local area organizations and immigration contacts to see what trainings are available for clinicians.
And then also for credible fear interviews specifically, most of those are done in the context of detention, and the only way to go in detention centers is with attorneys. And so I've been fortunate to work with legal service organizations in the Houston area, and that's given me access to do some of these things in detention. And in the community, there are many, many community initiatives in Houston. I have, there's one in particular, a collaboration with Dean Zayas' shop at the University of Texas, a program called Hear a Soul, where they are training people to think about mental health evaluations and how to do mental health evaluations and what kinds of mental health evaluations to do. And so the truth is this is an evolving area where we, we are working really hard to write down some criteria and to assist with the trainings in addition to that, which has been provided by Physicians for Human Rights. But a lot is kind of just in the works because of the exponential need in the communities as of current.
I think also the Center for Gender and Refugee Services, CGRS, out at UC Davis in California. I know they've started gathering a database of expert evaluators. It might be more on the country condition side, but we can check into whether they have any associated trainings.
We have one more question. With the current government policy, if a minor is given medical aid, will USCIS attempt to allege public charge? Chloe, do you happen to know?
Sure. So, public charge is really has to do with someone's admissibility to become a green card holder, and it really typically only happens for individuals who are seeking family-based immigration. So a lot of the forms of relief that children, especially children and families who have recently arrived, they're seeking asylum or special immigrant juvenile status or some of the other humanitarian forms of relief. And generally speaking, the public charge and admissibility doesn't apply. And also, I guess it's important to highlight that most newcomers to the United States who don't have any form of immigration visa or green card at the moment are not typically, they're not typically eligible for public benefits. So, they might not qualify in the first place, but that's really something that is applicable for green card holders in the family-based system, which is typically not the system that children are going through.
And that is all for today's webinar. We'd like to thank Dr. Roger Cardoso, Dr. Dean Zayas, Chloe Walker, and thank you all for joining us today and all the work that you are doing around children, immigration, and detention. We hope this is helpful. If you are in Texas, you have the course number and name for your CLE credits here, and we'll have this recording up on our website in the next few weeks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.